Now then, we can't do a show like this without talking about policy, without talking about regulation. I think we're all looking to see what's going on in and around the world. What we've done is try to assemble a panel of experts to really give you an idea about what is going on and what might be coming. So if I can invite Joyce to the stage, who will be chairing the panel, and I will hand over to Joyce now to actually introduce the session and bring up the panelists. So over to you, Joyce.
Right. Thank you very much, John, and good morning, everyone. My name is Joyce Hakmeh. I'm a senior researcher at Chatham House, and I'm very pleased to be here with you today to chair this conversation on policy and regulation, providing a global view. I'd like to thank the IoT Security Foundation for the invitation. I'm sure we're all here today because we believe IoT has a great potential to change the world for the better. However, the security of IoT, as we've heard from the previous speakers, remains a big challenge, a wicked challenge, a complex challenge, a transnational challenge that requires global approaches which go beyond the technical solutions. At the moment, there are billions of devices, of IoT devices, which are currently in use, with a greater number that will come online. I'm sure we've all heard the figures of 20 billion, or is it 40 billion, that will come online in the next few years. Many of these devices, as you know very well, lack basic security, and they can and have served as entry points for cyber attacks, as we've seen in the Mirai botnet, jeopardizing sensitive data and threatening the safety of individual users. So the security of IoT and how can this be achieved is increasingly becoming an important topic. And it's increasingly becoming high on the agenda of governments and regulators around the world, but not everywhere around the world. So governments are looking at how can they protect their consumers, the industry, and the economy, their economies from the misuse of the vulnerable technology. Our panel today will explore the global policy and regulatory landscape of IoT, comparing the different policy approaches that are being taken globally and exploring what it means for producers and users of IoT. I'd like to welcome the speakers on stage now. So starting with Andrew Laughlin from Which, and I'm happy to say, actually, we have 3 speakers who will represent different perspectives. So Andrew from Which will be giving us the Consumers Association perspective. David Rogers from Copper House is our tech guy on the panel and will give us the perspective of the tech solutions. And then Stephen Hermanson from Vodafone will give us the industry perspective. So the format that we will have for this session is one where we kick off with a few questions to our panelists. They'll give us their insights. And hopefully, if we have some time at the end, we'll turn to you for maybe a few questions from the floor. I'd like to start with you, David, and kind of to give this sort of overall or overview, if you want. When you look at the different approaches in regulation and standards in relation to IoT, what is your main observation, and where do you see are we heading? Are we heading towards fragmentation or defragmentation?
Yeah, it's a great question. The reality is at the moment that it's actually very, very positive. You know, when we started down this road probably 5 or 6 years ago, it was a relatively negative outlook for the world in terms of IoT, and we've heard some of the scare stories already this morning. But it's one of those things where every country in the world is affected by this, every citizen is affected by this, every government's affected by this. And so it actually makes the solution somewhat easier in terms of everybody is harmonized on the problem, and then it's collectively deciding what the solution is. And relatively, you know, if we boil it down to its basics, what we're talking about here is you know, a PCB with some chips on it running some software connected to the internet. And so there is a finite number of solutions. There's a finite amount of technology available to solve some of the problems that we have today. And so inevitably, people end up coming up with the same solutions, and some of them are the right solutions. So really, you know, what's been going on is this sort of period of countries and standards bodies and companies coming up with the solutions to avoid the major issues. We've had some big warnings which have kind of been helpful. So everyone will remember Mirai from 2016. We've been able to dodge some big bullets since then. But I think we are really on a positive trajectory right now, globally. So if I can just draw attention to the current work that's going on, for example, in European standards. So today, the draft EN, which is a European standard, so draft EN 303-645, is available and being reviewed by national standards organisations from now until February. That's a huge step forward, a huge positive for the world, and I really hope that that's adopted right across the world. Now, obviously, on top of that, there will be countries who perhaps take a different view, and I'm sure we'll talk a little bit about that later in the panel. But broadly, we have harmonisation, we have defragmentation, and that's been assisted by people like the IoTSecurity Foundation and all of the companies that are members of it, as well as the governments of the countries involved.
Andrew, I'd like to pick up on what David just said in terms of you have people kind of like recognize the problem and they're coming up with solutions, but you have so many solutions that you can pick from. But at least like the kind of the risks are sort of like there is awareness of the risks that exist. But I'd also like to pick up on one of the things that he said, because I think it's important we're providing a global view on what's going on in terms of like different countries following different approaches. What does that mean, when you have in technology different standards, right? And maybe previously countries had a liberal approach towards standards and governance more generally, but then you have new countries such as China who are becoming like a major influence at the global scene who do not necessarily follow the same approach. What does that mean for technology having different standards, and what can be done to harmonize these standards?
I think it's still a complex picture. I think it is really good that we've got that EN standard. Now, I think what really the thing about having some kind of anchor point is so beneficial, because not only does it help people who are engaged in testing, in bringing up standards of products, but it also finally gives a sort of a raft for everybody to sort of cling on to, really. I think previously there have been so many different things going on, so many different initiatives, that actually, for a manufacturer, it was actually quite confusing which horse to back, so to speak. And when people like me come to them and say, well, you've got to do this, this, and this, and then they say, well, I've been following this standard, I say, well, there's this standard over here. It's very confusing, and it's also very challenging as well, because we appreciate that actually it's a very much an evolving picture, especially when you are merging technology and technical aspects into traditional home goods. We're in uncharted waters with tumble dryers, with washing machines, with issues around safety, remote access. We've got a long history looking at kind of the safety of fridges and so on, when you're looking at kind of fire retardant materials and kind of lint trays which fill up and then get set on fire. These things happen, but then you add networking into the mix, and suddenly the problems start sort of tumbling outwards. But it's great now, actually, we're having some kind of consistency about how we're looking at how we're approaching it. And we can actually say, right, here's something to aim for, here's a blueprint. It's not the final, because there's still a lot of evolution to happen, but at least we've got some kind of raft to cling on to, as I'll keep going with that analogy. And I think so that's why we constantly are broadly supportive of that. We don't always test ourselves purely against the standards. Sometimes we will go beyond it, but it's great to have some kind of consistency that people can follow. As to the question of China, that's a slightly more tricky issue. Obviously there are a lot of things at play there. There's a hugely developing electronics market down in Shenzhen. Obviously there's some huge benefits to the open source culture down there and so on. But obviously there are some kind of issues with the hardware and the software stack that need to be considered, and the way things are evolving. But at least now we're having some consistency, and also that can be going to the retail and e-commerce chain as well. And then some of that will start to filter backwards.
Right. Thank you. Stephen, do you agree with this view on, like, do we have consistency? And given that you work for a multinational company and you have presence in different countries, how is the different regulation standards impacting you, and how are you trying to address that?
Sure. So a lot of what's been said is really familiar, and it sometimes helps when thinking about future public policy just to sort of break it into parts. And we tend to look at 4 areas: device application, connectivity, and the data. Now, vulnerabilities can manifest across any of those parts, and so it's really important, if you want to ensure an appropriate policy response to security, that all of those particular parts are playing their particular role. And if you take data, for example, there's already really stringent obligations in the form of GDPR. If you take connectivity or the network side, there's already significant obligations on network operators in terms of, in Europe, the Communications Code and the NIS Directive. So the question is how do we bring those other parts along so that we can create a proper horizontal approach that encompasses all of those elements and measures that have meaningful effect across that entire system and not just in individual areas, because they all need to work in harmony. And on the connectivity side, we've seen this debate play out really strongly. For example, and most people will probably be familiar with it now, the EU 5G risk assessment. Really good piece of work, common risk assessment. We're really supportive of the EU-wide measures that would flow from that. And we stress EU-wide because we have to remember we shouldn't take our foot off the pedal here when we're thinking about the risk of fragmentation. Of course, we need to protect innovation, and we always need to act in a proportionate way relative to the risk. I think those are fundamentals that we shouldn't lose sight of. And in this journey, we've noticed that in the EU in particular, telco and digital regulation is often not fit for purpose for IoT. It's designed for an era of person-to-person communications. And so we need a new framework that allows us to deal with machine-to-machine communications, that allows us to treat cellular and non-cellular connectivity equally, and allows us to bring that entire ecosystem together on a journey to the point we want to reach.
David, having sort of been involved in what the UK has been doing around IoT, and for many the code of practice has been hailed as good model that a lot of countries are looking at and getting inspired from. What would you say are the kind of biggest breakthrough in the last 5 years in this landscape, and what have we learned from that experience in terms of industry engaging with regulated government, and what remains as big challenges?
So I think from my own perspective, and I realised this fairly close to the start of the work on the Code of Practice, was that we were already standing on the shoulders of giants. And the reason why I say that is that there's been a huge amount of work over the past 20 years from, for example, the security research community, so the hacking community, on getting companies to face up to the products that they put out there and the security vulnerabilities that are then exploited by criminals, and exposing the fact that they're not doing anything about it. And so that's become essentially normalized through something called vulnerability disclosure. So it's very easy for somebody like me to walk into a meeting and say, this is the right way to do this, and be on solid ground, whereas maybe 10 years ago I would not have been in that position. The same with our ability to tolerate bad practices, so default passwords, for example. It's all well and good people saying, oh, well, we need to educate users. Well, that's a ridiculous argument now. We've tried to do that for so long, it didn't work. It's part of the picture, but it's not the solution. And staring us in the face is the default password problem, and nobody's doing anything about it. So it was kind of, for me at least anyway, it was easy to say, let's just get rid of default passwords. And we managed to get the support for that. So I think those are the sort of major things. They're really the result of hidden work by many people around the world. that haven't been acknowledged for it, but we're able to now put that into practice and actually regulate and legislate for it, hopefully. And you know, that's the sort of culmination of where we are.
Do you agree with that, Andrew? I mean, it's sort of like a positive description that we are able to influence the policy making, etc. What is the kind of, from the consumer's point of view, and also kind of, if you can comment on the, you know, where does the onus fall? Is it like consumers? We are moving away from that model.
Yeah, I can't agree enough with that. I mean, I think if you're relying on consumers to think about security, you've already failed, to be perfectly honest. Our goal is to make sure they never have to think about it. And we don't want them to think about fire safety either. We don't want them to buy a product thinking, should I get this, you know, kind of checked for whether it's past electrical safety regs. You know, we can't assume consumers are going to do anything at all. We have to assume they're just going to do the path of least resistance. They're going to plug it in, and it's going to do what they hope it's going to do. So we have to work backwards to how we can get a position where they can just do that. Currently, we know they probably can't, I think, but it's really about that's the end goal. So you go to Currys or Argos or Amazon or wherever you buy your products, you just choose what you want and you plug it in and off you go. And obviously there are cyber hygiene things that we still need to remind the public. I mean, we can't just sort of say, you know, go wild, but we have to say in a product context, the thinking has to be done for them, whether that's you know, default passwords, making sure they're not in place, whether that's you know, actually how it manages their data and their personal information, to the point where some of the risks that were talked about by Leonie, which I think are very, very pressing, we've got to get ahead of those. You know, I often, when I do stories, I get asked, have you got any case studies? And I kind of, every time I hear that, it kind of sort of makes my skin crawl slightly, because I don't really want any case studies. I don't want to have people be abused through technology. I don't want to have that situation. And I don't want to have a situation where I have to make a point about why this matters by having victims like sort of strewn around my feet. You know, I don't want that situation. And actually all the work we're trying to do is to stop that from happening. We're trying to get ahead of this before it comes, like it is with the open internet, you know, where people have got so much risk out there. And it's really important that we get our house in order now before the IoT gets even more and more into people's lives and into people's daily lives, and just make sure we get the basic security right, because it will combat most of the issues.
Right. I mean, just to kind of follow up on what one of the things that you've said is like, you know, we wanted to say to consumers, go and buy this stuff and just like plug it in, and then you should be able to use it as it was meant to be used for. So that's the message we're sending. We're going to take responsibilities. We're going to think of the security for you, secure by design, which is like a massive initiative within the UK government. But when we talk about cybersecurity more generally, the approach is different. The approach is, you know, as you said, you have to have more cyber hygiene, you have to be vigilant, you have to change your password, you have to back up your data, etc. Do you think, are we confusing consumers and users by sending different messages? Like, on one hand, it's very much, you know, you have to play active role. When it comes to IoT, no, don't worry, you know, we'll do that for you.
I spend a lot of time speaking to people who are way cleverer than me about technology, know way more than me, and way more in depth, and I kind of get lost down that rabbit hole. So every now and then I'll go and sit over on our help desk, and I'll listen to someone explain how to use Google, and then I'll realize that's where a lot of consumers are, you know, and you know, that is where the mass majority of people are, and you cannot assume anything. You have to help them, of course. You know, you know, there are genuine things that we kind of help people set good passwords and help people take the common sense approach. But when it comes to technical issues, when it comes to situations where we can design out, it is possible to design out the need for the consumer to think about it. I don't see why we shouldn't do it. You know, if we can do it, and we know we can do it, because there's some companies that are really, really good at this kind of stuff. There's some really good practice going on. It's certainly not all bad. You know, and actually, as David was saying, I think we are in a lot better picture. Partially from the kind of disclosures from researchers, but partially just from companies being more engaged in this and saying, actually, I'm going to make privacy and security one of my key aspects, and someone's maybe cheerleaded that in the company, or it's just become something that they wanted to do. So we definitely need to highlight that good practice as much as we highlight bad practice. It doesn't come natural to me as a journalist, but I think it's really, really important. And as I say, it's possible to design out a lot of these issues, and then of course we can help people with the extra layers of cyber hygiene, considering what they share and what they do and how they engage and all that kind of thing. But the basics, the security basics, I think we need to just get those designed out and sorted as the product is being made. And that will help a lot with the standard, obviously, but it will help a lot more with just the natural rising of the tide and all ships raising as the market improves.
Right. Stephen, do you share that view? What is your take on this? And what is, in your opinion, the role that industry is playing in this sort of like policy making, regulation and standards?
Sure. So when looking for policy fixes, we spent quite a bit of time keeping an eye on the standards debate and the codes of practice and so forth that are emerging. And it's hugely encouraging to see some harmonization and synchronization in that space. When the new publication comes out, we tend to spool to the back and work out how many other standards they've cross-referenced or acknowledged. And it's encouraging to see IoTSF work represented in, as we heard earlier, in some of these developments. And we just need to maintain momentum on that because national approaches, fragmented approaches, are hugely damaging to growth and acceleration in the IoT space, right? So we can't necessarily scale in the way we would like to when we're confronted with that fragmentation, which is still an existential threat to the industry. So more to do, really. Keep the momentum going in that harmonization effort. And in that sense, the policy thinkers can latch on to a stable and common platform of things to build on.
So the message that I'm getting from the three of you is quite a positive message in a way. Yes, there are big challenges and some kind of countries you can't do much about, but for the rest of us, there is the more kind of sort of like going towards defragmentation, harmonization. Industry and other players are playing an active role. We now have clarity in terms of the role of consumers and what we should do to support them. So there is obviously understanding the problem and then regulating the problem, but there's also the enforcing this regulation. So when it comes to enforcement, what are the trends that you are seeing? What are the big challenges that remain? I'll start with you, David, and maybe you can have your input as well.
Well, I mean, I'll be frank about this. The vast majority of the insecure IoT is coming out of China. So that's the problem that we have to face up to on multiple levels. The Chinese government need to kind of face up to that. And, they need to solve that problem internally. But then for the consumers of those products and for the retailers of those products, we need to do something in the interim. So, and unfortunately that means, withdrawing products where they are identified to be insecure. Being selfish as a British citizen, I don't want harm to be caused to me or my friends or to other people in the country just because somebody was able to get away with selling something that was completely poor and insecure. So it's kind of like the safety of products, which you were saying. Nobody wants to have something that's going to set fire to their children, right? Or an e-cigarette that's going to blow up in their face. It's the same for security, but it's a bit more hidden. And the effects can sometimes happen, very much later than when you originally bought it. And whether it's harm through domestic, so controlling and abusive behavior is very, very disturbing, I find. Or through to nation-state cyber attacks. That's a very, very real threat. So if we have this whole nation of, to be honest, crappy, insecure products from China, then we're totally exposed as a country. There's holes in everything. And the scale of that is unacceptable. So we need to deal with that head on. you know, and I'm sure that many governments share that view. It's just my individual view, but we need to tackle that. That is the problem of today and will be tomorrow.
Right. Andrew, what are your views on enforcement, and how do we actually tackle the challenge of like online marketplaces?
Yeah, we actually just put out a story, I think this week actually, on online marketplaces. It's a big push for us. It's not just IoT kit, it's also smoke alarms, toys, counterfeits, fakes. There's huge problems. The real benefit of an online marketplace, you know, the ability to kind of shop in a different way is also obviously the real disadvantage of it, because actually the controls are much not as much as a traditional bricks and mortar store or traditional website e-commerce site. So you're actually in that kind of weird grey area where obviously the consumers like it. Usually it's low cost products. You know, I did a story about a couple of months ago on wireless cameras, particularly coming from kind of white label around sort of Shenzhen market, and actually took a quite close look at that. And actually, it's the same as true with the Chinese market, because actually the real key strength, the innovation, the ability to open source, the ability to share technology, the ability to build and scale and release rapidly on a scale that we've never seen before, quite incredible, is also the disadvantage, which means that the controls are not necessarily there, and actually what it's relying on is feedback through the chain, through the retail chain, which isn't coming, because the retailers obviously will say, well, this product meets all European compliance legislation, so it's obviously, you know, it's been checked for electrical safety, it's maybe got a CE mark or whatever. There is no kind of thing that's saying, well, actually it's failing some security standards, because currently there isn't an agreed standard. So you're in this kind of circular situation where you're saying this really matters, but then people are saying, well, show me why it matters. And the consumers are kind of not sure about it, but they're saying, I get my wireless camera for £30, I don't care. So you're in a bit of a vicious circle right now, and that will improve, I think. We're certainly starting to see that, you know, when it gets fed back up the retail chain, that security is worth doing, and it does get sorted back up in the stack somewhere. But you know, we did find a server with almost 2 million devices worldwide on it, with no seeming provenance. Who knows who's running it? Who knows who's maintaining it? Completely vulnerable. It's a massive problem. You know, you just need to weaponize that as a botnet, and you've got a certainly nice fighting fund if you're so inclined. So these are real issues, and we're going to have a massive shortfall even when regulation comes in, because we're going to have to do multiple product life cycles before it comes through. So we are going to need some kind of sheriff for the Wild West. Right. Not necessarily putting myself forward for that. But I think we will need that, and we will need an actual continued pressure throughout the industry, that reminding people why it is important, in the gap of it being a requirement. And I think, who can enforce that elsewhere? I mean, you know, trading standards are already quite stretched. You know, OPSS is, you know, it's difficult. So it's not clear, but I think we are going to have some good actors and some good people pushing on it in the interim to make some real change until we get that more established regulation footing.
So on the question of enforcement, it's possible to look at it in two parts, perhaps. You got the before the event and after the event. So before the event is very much the realm of due diligence, certification, proper secure by design, all things that we know and understand really well. Just need to press ahead, do more, go faster. On post-event enforcement, which is typically where the debate lands, it's really important that sellers, retailers, whoever's in the front line here, have appropriate remedies available to them to pursue recourse through the supply chain. And this is part of that new regulatory framework that we need. I think missing that part of it is a real danger.
I think it was you, David, who kind of brought up the issue of like nation-state threats. And, we've all followed the 5G debate and, what's going on, especially, like the trade war and all of that. But we also know that 5G will revolutionize the internet as we know it and will allow IoT really to kind of like take off in terms of like smart cities and the smart infrastructure, etc. So we're looking really at like a much more complex problem that will affect livelihoods and lives as well in the next, 5 to 10 years. Are we thinking, about this in the current regulation efforts?
Yeah, I think broadly people have that understanding, and essentially what it is the attack surface is increasing in a massive way, and the effects of it could increase significantly. So that's, I would say, the anxiety. And often people will ask me, why did, for example, the IoTSF or other organizations start with consumer IoT? And it's like, well, that's the obvious manifestation of the problem. But also a lot of that equipment is used within the enterprise. It is used within industrial infrastructure. It is used within so-called smart cities. We, by the way, have a long way to go with smart cities. The sort of weak links, that low-hanging fruits, everybody talks about the example of the fish tank in the casino problem, right? That will be, multiplied with physically accessible equipment on the street that is interacting peer-to-peer with cars, with passers-by, with mobile devices. And to be honest, we don't actually have enough people to deal with that problem. We don't have enough people to deal with the problems we have today. So we really need to get our house in order. You mentioned supply chain security and some of the issues that we have there around 5G and future networks. I think the light is shining on network equipment vendors right now, not just Chinese ones. And collectively, we need to get our house in order, as Stephen says, on secure by design. Security can no longer be an afterthought. And that education piece needs to stem down from CEOs and boards need to be educated. It's not just about the engineers, that they need to stop before they make a decision where they decide not to include security or that security can be added on later, because I still see that attitude now. And, that's where the regulators and governments can help as well by penalising people potentially as well as the equipment itself, and highlighting that it's insecure.
You said we don't have the capacity to deal with these challenges yet, and we need to get our house in order. So what is it that we actually need? I mean, if this is coming from the UK, right, which is meant to be one of the biggest countries and pioneers on cybersecurity, what is it that we need to do? And what sort of capacity is lacking?
Okay, so it's across multiple areas, and you're right. In the UK is really leading the way in terms of the thinking on this. The challenge that we've got is a lot of legacy. So we will always carry that legacy, and we'll build it up. And John talked earlier about security debt. So we're gathering this security debt. I think one thing that I would like to see beyond 5G is actually potentially a clean break, so that we can actually break some of that legacy. Now, Stephen might disagree with me on this, but I know that debate was had around 5G, whether to essentially disconnect standalone 5G from the legacy, because that would stop a lot of the problems that we've had going back to the days of 2G. And I think you do kind of need some of that step change where you need to kind of move on. We will still have IP-connected networks for a very long time. I know that some countries are trying to build, should we say, alternative internet. They will fail. There's no doubt about it. The scale that we have with IP-connected networks is so large now and actually relatively resilient that any kind of upstart is going to suffer all of the issues and then some. But Stephen, I don't know, what do you think of this?
Well, I think as networks evolve, they're going to try and bring to bear some of the additional security capabilities and features that help improve the situation. at the same time remove or fix some of those issues that may remain. But the key point not to lose sight of is that you need to treat the network component here fairly across all types of connectivity, whether it's cellular or non-cellular. Classic case in point, intelligent transport systems need to be able to rely on technology neutrality in terms of connectivity. That's how you incentivize all players here to do the right thing and invest in the space.
Any comments?
I think it's a massive challenge. I think, you know, in an ideal world, it would be great to have a sort of amnesty in which we go, okay, all those products that we know are going to have problematic, we're just going to switch them off. But that's not how consumers work. You know, they've keeping these products in their houses for 30 years. They used to, like washing machines. I've had my Maytag washing machine for 30 years. That's what I'm going to do with my new smart washing machine. But, you know, there's a bit of an education piece there. But consumers are not going to behave how you want them to behave. They're going to do stuff which is totally out there, and they're going to use products in bad ways. So there is that security debt piece does sort of keep me awake at night, but I think, you know, we also have to say that in a lot of product areas, adoption is quite low right now, so we still have an opportunity to actually counter a lot of that security debt and say, okay, this generation, next generation of products, they are going to have that low-hanging fruit. You know, we've built a test program that covers the low-hanging fruit, and we actually roll that out to our consumer organisation partners around the world. So we are kind of pushing on that, but it is obviously post-release products. But I think the important thing is, you know, there is still time to sort of secure a lot of these devices, make them better, and then reduce that kind of exposure from that security debt. So, because we just don't have the luxury of saying, let's wipe our face and start again. Right. Even with 5G, it's already happening. I think we have to kind of look at it as a kind of a challenge that is going to evolve constantly, and we're just going to have to keep going with it.
But we do have the regulatory levers. You know, governments haven't really used those yet. They've kind of taken a quite laissez-faire attitude with the market, sort of self-regulating and growing itself. That's what they've been concentrating on. Telecoms regulators have been concentrating on growth of subscribers globally, and now they need to start to pull the regulatory levers that they have in terms of saying, no, this is beyond the realms of acceptability. You know, we've given you your chance, and you failed. But the problem is, and this is a general problem, we don't have enough engineers in government, right, worldwide. So I'm constantly impressed by policymakers understanding technology, but because we have that lack of engineers and we have that lack of deep understanding, is that they may go too far and compound innovation, and we kind of need to find that right balance. But you know, there's no way that we can tolerate the situation we have now. If you read the HCSEC report on Huawei, now that's just one company. That's the only company that we know to that depth of detail. There will be others that just haven't been looked at. But the stuff in there was absolutely appalling. The engineering was garbage. And they said 10 years ago, oh, we'll fix it. 10 years later, they still haven't fixed it. So how can governments trust companies that act in that way? It's irresponsible. So of course, they inevitably have to regulate and penalise those companies.
And I think the most important thing about the report is that as you said, you know, like it had the new security threats are emerging, but also security threats that were highlighted before, nothing has been done in order to address them. And I think this is of absolute importance, and this is the big risk, but it hasn't been highlighted enough in the media. When we talk about 5G, we talk about, is it first mover advantage, who's going to win? Is it US, is it China? What is Donald Trump doing about it? So we kind of deviated the conversation from the security concerns towards trade and kind of focused on one element of the debate, which I think is misleading.
And actually what we're talking about is product quality. It's just hidden product quality.
Right.
So I guess that's what you guys look at. Yeah. And, you know, and Vodafone might disagree with me here, but this also rests at the hands of the operators as well, is that they've paid bottom dollar for equipment in their RFP processes, and they've ended up with the junk that they bought.
Right.
and they're having to deal with that now.
Right.
And it's not easy to rip it out.
No.
That's the harsh truth. Nobody will normally tell you that, but that is the truth. And so we just kind of need to accept that situation and say no more. From now on, we will have secure by design, and we will hold those companies, their feet to the fire in terms of making sure. We know what good looks like, we just need to make sure that it is done.
But I think we have to be really careful about making regulation not a box-ticking exercise. We've got the regulation, it's done. It's not how it works.
No.
We thought that everybody was adhering to electrical safety legislation, and then suddenly we see fires and we see products failing, and product safety that we thought was actually a working system suddenly starts falling apart at the edges, and that's a long system that's been in place. So we can't just tick a box and say, right, regulation's done. We'll have to create a whole system of enforcement, of checking, but also of actually companies engaging and engaging positively as a nice to have, something they can market, but also a requirement. We can't just have a situation where someone goes, oh, I didn't think about it, or I didn't really think it mattered, or no consumer asked for it. We can't have a situation like that. It has to be, yes, what's your security policy? How have you made sure this is secure for consumers? Not against day zero, but against the most common threats that are out there. And we have to kind of create that culture change, because it won't just be the last stop when regulation comes in, it will just be the beginning, really.
And it is a sort of a journey, isn't it? Like, we try something, we learn from it, technology is developing, we reflect on this, we change the way we do things, how we make it more enforceable, how do we make sure that it is reflecting the best interest of consumers, but also the producers of that technology. I'm going to ask John, do we have a couple of minutes for questions from the floor, or do we have to close?